Washington, a few weeks back, the Commanders made a signing that honestly didn't get nearly enough attention when it happened. They brought in veteran cornerback Rasul Douglas. On the surface, it looks like a minor depth move, the kind of transaction that barely makes a headline during a slow stretch of the offseason. But now that we've had time to sit with it, to really think it through, I want to make the case that this signing means a lot more than just adding a body to the cornerback room. This move is a symbol. It's proof that something has genuinely shifted inside this organization, and for longtime fans of this team, that shift is exactly the kind of thing you've been waiting years to see. Let's start with the practical reasons this signing had to happen, because there were real, obvious needs driving it before we even get into the bigger picture. Washington was sitting in a genuinely thin spot at cornerback heading into camp. You had four names you could really trust: Troy Apke, Mike Sainristil, Quan Williams, and Emmanuel Forbes. Four guys. And around this league, when you look at a healthy, well-built cornerback room, teams typically want at least five reliable options because injuries and matchups demand that kind of depth over the course of a season. Beyond those four names, things got shaky fast. You're talking about guys like Fred Davis, an undrafted rookie out of Northwestern, or depth pieces buried on the practice squad who simply aren't the caliber of player you want forced into meaningful defensive snaps if something goes wrong. And on top of the pure numbers problem, Troy Apke himself was already dealing with a handful of injuries, which made the depth situation even more urgent than it looked on paper. So bringing in Rasul Douglas wasn't just about filling a roster spot, it was about bringing in a genuinely good player with a real track record. This is a guy who has appeared in 135 career NFL games, with 93 of those as a starter. Last season alone, playing for the Miami Dolphins, he started 13 games and recorded 62 tackles, 2 interceptions, and 13 passes defended, numbers strong enough that he ended up being regarded as Miami's best cornerback by the end of the year. Nobody outside of Miami really expected that level of production from him last season, and he delivered it anyway. There's also a physical element to this signing that matters more than people realize. Rasul Douglas stands 6'2" and weighs over 200 pounds, and that size brings something this cornerback room was genuinely missing. You can't build a competitive defensive backfield entirely out of smaller, quicker, slot-oriented corners. You also need length and physicality on the outside to match up against bigger receivers around this league. Mike Sainristil, for example, has some real questions about whether he has the length to hold up as a true outside starter after struggling in an inside role a season ago. Now, instead of being forced to figure that out under duress, the coaching staff has a genuinely capable outside veteran option in Rasul Douglas as insurance. Maybe he's not your long-term starter at this stage of his career, but he's a guy who has bounced around the league, started real games, and can absolutely step in and hold his own if called upon, which is exactly the kind of insurance policy you want compared to leaning on an undrafted rookie who hasn't proven anything at this level yet. And it's not just about talent and size, it's about leadership and competition too. Some people around this team's coverage have even floated the idea that Rasul Douglas might already be the best cornerback in that entire room. Think about that for a second. Troy Apke hasn't really put together a full, healthy, standout season at this point in his career. Mike Sainristil had a strong rookie year but hasn't necessarily built on that since. Emmanuel Forbes has shown flashes but hasn't had that true breakout year yet either. Rasul Douglas walks in with an arsenal that includes 21 career interceptions, 4 forced fumbles, 3 sacks, nearly 400 career solo tackles, and over 500 total tackles across his career. That's the sum of a guy who has been a legitimately good NFL player for a long stretch of time, and having that kind of veteran presence in a room full of younger, still developing talent raises the floor of the entire unit. If this defense finds itself in a playoff push later this season, having a guy who's been through multiple postseason runs and multiple different defensive schemes in that room is exactly the kind of steady presence that matters when the games get bigger. And then there's the financial piece, which honestly makes this signing even easier to feel good about. This wasn't some franchise-altering multi-year commitment. Washington signed Rasul Douglas to a one-year deal worth just $3.8 million. That's a low-cost, high-value insurance policy, one that gives Adam Peters plenty of continued flexibility moving forward. And on top of the on-field value, there's a development benefit here too. Younger corners like Troy Apke now have a genuine veteran presence in that room to learn from every single day in practice, which is exactly the kind of mentorship that accelerates a young player's growth. So yes, there were very real, very obvious reasons for the Commanders to make this move, and I like every single one of those reasons individually. But here's why I think this signing matters for a much bigger reason than just cornerback depth. Because it represents a genuine philosophical shift for this entire organization. And if you've followed this team for any real length of time, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Because we've seen this movie before, and it never used to end this way. In years past, this is exactly the kind of situation where this organization would have simply shrugged and moved on. Cornerbacks coach William Gay actually said publicly a few weeks back that the staff liked what they had at the top of the cornerback room, but that there wasn't real depth behind those top guys. And in the old regime, in the old version of this franchise, that admission probably just sits there. Nothing happens. The team goes into the season thin, crosses its fingers, and hopes injuries don't strike that position group. But this time, Adam Peters and Dan Quinn heard that concern and reacted quickly, going out and adding a proven veteran to address it directly. That kind of responsiveness, that willingness to actually fix a problem the moment it's identified rather than hoping it goes away on its own, is exactly the kind of organizational behavior that simply didn't exist here in years past. And you don't have to go back very far to see the cost of ignoring depth. Just look at last season. Yes, this team dealt with a genuinely brutal run of injuries across the roster. But it wasn't only about who got hurt, it was about what happened once those injuries hit, because the depth simply wasn't NFL caliber in a lot of spots. Remember that preseason game against the Ravens where their depth pieces were clearly a level above what Washington could roll out. That gap in depth quality is exactly why this team lost all 3 preseason games last year. And it's exactly why, once the injuries piled up during the regular season, there wasn't a capable replacement waiting in the wings at several key positions. At receiver specifically, depth options simply weren't NFL caliber talent last season. And that showed up on the field in a very real way once the top of that depth chart got hit with injuries. And this isn't just a one-year problem either. This is a pattern that's shown up repeatedly throughout this franchise's recent history. Go back to the 4-13 season a few years ago. That roster was critically thin at offensive tackle and along the defensive line, and the team ended up ranking dead last in overall team efficiency metrics that season. Go back even further to a stretch where, coming off a promising 10-6 playoff campaign, this team completely collapsed the very next season to a 3-13 record, and a huge part of that collapse got traced directly back to a lack of young talent capable of backing up the veteran core, combined with poor depth across the entire roster. This has been a recurring theme for this organization for years. Build a competitive top of the roster, then completely neglect the depth underneath it, and watch the whole thing collapse the moment injuries hit, which in the NFL, they always eventually do. And that's really the core frustration a lot of longtime fans of this team have carried for years. It was never really about a single bad draft class or a single unlucky injury season. It was about a pattern of behavior at the organizational level, an unwillingness to invest in the unglamorous, unsexy parts of roster building. Signing a proven veteran depth piece for under $4 million doesn't generate headlines the way a splashy free agent addition does. And it's exactly the kind of move that gets overlooked or skipped entirely by front offices that are more concerned with optics than with actually building a sustainable, resilient roster capable of surviving a full 16-plus game season with all the attrition that comes with it. which is exactly why this Rasul Douglas signing feels like such a meaningful departure from that old pattern. Realistically, if you rewind the clock just one offseason, there's a real chance the previous version of this front office doesn't even make this move. Adam Peters historically hasn't been the most aggressive spender in free agency, and he's typically been fairly conservative with how he allocates resources. But look at what we've actually seen from him this offseason. He's been aggressive. He's been willing to spend real money when the situation called for it. And I want to highlight the flexibility on display here specifically because it's genuinely impressive. This is a front office that spent real money this offseason primarily on players under 30 years old, making sure the core of this roster is built around players entering or already in their athletic prime. But when a specific situational need came up, cornerback depth, Adam Peters didn't rigidly stick to some arbitrary age cutoff just for the sake of consistency. He looked at a 31-year-old veteran in Rasul Douglas, recognized exactly what the room needed, and made the move anyway. That kind of situational flexibility, rather than a stubborn, one-size-fits-all approach to team building, is exactly the kind of adaptable decision-making that separates good front offices from mediocre ones around this league. So put it all together, and this signing really does symbolize something bigger than a single roster transaction. It shows an organization that finally listens to its own coaching staff when they flag a real concern. It shows a front office willing to spend money reactively when a need arises rather than sticking rigidly to a predetermined off-season plan. And it shows a level of situational awareness and flexibility that simply wasn't present in prior regimes running this franchise. That's a genuinely exciting sign heading into a season with plenty of other question marks still floating around this roster. Now, switching gears a bit, there's some other interesting news worth touching on today. There was a report floating around recently that named a handful of players around the league expected to become legitimate household names by the time this season wraps up. Alongside some obvious names from other teams, 2 Commanders players made that list, and a third got mentioned further down as well, which I think is genuinely worth digging into. First up is offensive tackle Josh Conklin. And look, I get why a lot of fans weren't thrilled with his play as a rookie last season. There were some costly penalties at times, and there were stretches where he clearly lacked the functional strength you want from a starting offensive tackle in this league. But here's what people are forgetting. He faced an absolutely brutal opening stretch of competition as a rookie. Week 1 against the Giants, Week 3 against the Raiders. That's a gauntlet of some of the toughest edge rushers in the entire league right out of the gate. You're talking about facing Max Crosby, and then turning around and facing a Giants front stacked with dangerous edge talent like Brian Burns and Kayvon Thibodeau. That's about as difficult of a welcome to the NFL as any rookie tackle could possibly draw, and very few people gave him any credit for simply surviving that stretch. On top of that, remember, he was a somewhat unconventional pick at his draft slot, which created some outsized expectations for immediate dominance that honestly weren't fair for a player his age. And this offseason, he's put in serious work, he's noticeably added strength and reshaped his body in a real way. He's also been working directly with veteran tackle Laramie Tunsil, someone he actually trained alongside back at Alabama, which is exactly the kind of high-level mentorship that should accelerate his development. Add in the fact that he's still only 22 years old and still physically maturing into his frame, and I genuinely believe this is a breakout candidate at 6'4" and over 300 pounds. I was genuinely higher on him than most evaluators coming out of college. There was actually a league executive who suggested that if he'd stayed in school another year, he could have been a legitimate top 5 pick. He came out early instead, took his lumps as a rookie against a brutal schedule, and now he's put the work in physically to take that next step. I'm genuinely excited to see what he looks like this season. It's also worth remembering just how much a single offseason of physical development can change a young offensive lineman's trajectory. Going from a lean, still maturing rookie frame to a genuinely imposing 6'4", 315-pound presence isn't a cosmetic change, It directly translates to better anchor strength in pass protection and more functional power at the point of attack in the run game. Combine that physical transformation with direct, hands-on mentorship from a veteran of Laramie Tunsil's caliber. Someone who has literally played at an all-pro level at the same position, and you've got all the ingredients for a legitimate second-year leap. Rookie tackles who survive a brutal schedule and then dedicate a full off-season to correcting their physical shortcomings are exactly the type of players who tend to make that jump from liability to legitimate starter in year 2. The next name on that list is cornerback Trey Amos, and he's someone Pro Football Focus specifically flagged as a rising star and legitimate breakout candidate heading into this year. This is a player with real swagger and real physical tools, good size, good length for the outside cornerback position. He was playing well last season before suffering a broken leg against the Seahawks that ended his year prematurely. But the encouraging news is that he recently confirmed himself that he's on track and expects to be fully ready for training camp this year, which is exactly what you want to hear from a player coming off that kind of significant injury. He's reportedly been training alongside some Eagles players this offseason as well, continuing to sharpen his game. This is a guy with genuinely elite movement skills for his size, and if he's fully healthy, I think he's got a real shot at picking off a handful of passes and making a legitimate leap this season. And then there's Trey Waynes, who got mentioned further down that same list, and honestly, this feels like the year he needs to step up in a real way. Outside of Rasul Douglas, this roster simply doesn't have a ton of proven outside cornerback options walking into the season. Mike Sainristil, even if the staff experiments with him on the outside, profiles much more as a slot corner given his size at 5'9". Mecole Hardman similarly isn't built to hold up as a true outside boundary corner at his size either. So there's a real opportunity here for Trey Waynes to claim a significant role, and he's going to be tested immediately given this schedule. You're talking about facing CeeDee Lamb and George Pickens with the Cowboys, and Malik Neighbors with the Giants right out of the gate. That's about as difficult of a slate of receiver matchups as any young cornerback could ask for, and it's exactly the kind of challenge that either forges a legitimate NFL starter or exposes real limitations. I love that he's getting national recognition as a name to watch, but recognition alone doesn't win football games. He's going to have to go out and actually perform against that level of competition to justify the hype. And finally, as we wrap up today, we are officially just 1 day away from Commanders rookies reporting to training camp. This is genuinely one of my favorite times of the entire football calendar. Guys like the team's top rookies aren't walking into a completely unfamiliar building either. They've already been through rookie minicamp, and they participated in both organized team activities and mandatory minicamp earlier this offseason, so there's already a real foundation of familiarity in place heading into camp. Tomorrow, these players will report, go through their physicals, and officially kick off this next chapter of the offseason calendar. A handful of teams around the league, including the Cardinals and Panthers, already opened their own training camps yesterday, so the league-wide machine is already rolling. Expect a handful of roster transactions to trickle in over the next day or two, as teams finalize things before padded practices begin in earnest, and I'll have a much deeper breakdown covering this entire rookie class once camp officially gets underway. So that's where things stand right now for the Washington Commanders. A cornerback room that got meaningfully upgraded through a signing that says a lot more about this organization's direction than its box score suggests, a couple of legitimate breakout candidates worth watching closely once pads come on, and training camp officially arriving tomorrow to kick off this next chapter of the 2026 season. Let me know down in the comments what you guys think. Does this Rasul Douglas signing genuinely represent a real cultural shift for this front office? Or am I reading too much into a fairly routine depth move? And who are you most excited to watch once training camp gets rolling tomorrow? Josh Conklin, Trey Amos, Trey Waynes, or somebody else entirely? Drop your thoughts below. And if you're enjoying this kind of coverage, make sure you hit that like button and get subscribed to this channel. We are incredibly close to a really big subscriber milestone, and every single subscription genuinely helps push us over that line. I'll be back very soon with a full breakdown of this entire rookie class as training camp gets underway. Hail to the Commanders, and I'll see you guys next time.
Hey everyone,
Peace
I'm
out.
working to hit 1,000 subscribers, and I need your help to get there. If you enjoy this content, please hit that subscribe button right now.